And this morning's session basically is about implementation, about practical experiences in different countries. And first speaker is Guy Standing, Professor of Development Studies at University of London, co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network, known for a lot of things. I just picked this book here, The Precariat, which has been discussed a lot also in this country over the last few months. This whole change, the new dangerous class. There's a lot of fear in the world today, a lot of danger, but this is one factor contributing to a lack of stability, possibly. Please, Guy Standing.
Good morning, and one of the great pleasures of being in Bien, the basic income movement, is that we move around and it's like a journey, and we're always meeting friends along the journey, and it's so nice to see so many people that we've got to know over the years. It's a great pleasure. My job this morning is to set the context for our two-day debate, and I'm delighted that we had the leader of the Alternativet to open, because my view, movements like the Alternativet represent the precariat. There are movements growing everywhere, and we need such movements. And fundamental to this alternative, of course, is basic income. Now, for me, this is a particularly poignant month because it's our 30th anniversary. 30th anniversary this month when we founded Bien and began a long journey. When we started, we were a group of much longer-haired individuals, radicals, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And what's great is to see so many people about the age I was then, today, and in our movement, taking over from us. And where's Carl? Because Carl is doing a fantastic job with Louise as co-chairs, but they should be looking behind them for the next generation to take over from them. And it's great, because we're growing strong, and that's the first point that I'm delighted to say. And this year has become a particularly strong year. And a lot of people are joining from strange positions on the right, on the left. Suddenly, they're inventing basic income. You read blogs every day where someone, my idea is a basic income. It's great. Second, I've just published a book, which I have a few copies if anyone is interested, which is my sort of defining approach to basic income. And it takes the Thomas Paine arguments forward. It's called The Corruption of Capitalism. It's about rentier capitalism and how we can use that as a moral and economic justification for funding a basic income. And the third, and I can boast on this one relative to everybody here, is that for my pains, and I've lost a lot of hair and aged a lot, but I have actually been involved in doing 5 pilot basic income schemes. And there's one thing I can guarantee, only one thing about pilots. You will make mistakes. That's the only thing I can guarantee. Now, I want to reiterate a point which is outside pilots. But we must remember the justification for a basic income, however we see it, is fundamentally about social justice. We believe in a basic income because it's an instrument for promoting and strengthening social justice. That's first. The second is we believe in a basic income because it enhances freedom. Enhances what we call Republican freedom, the freedom to be not dominated, the freedom of exit, the freedom to say no, right? And the third reason we support basic income is it's a means of giving us basic security. We need security in order to be rational, to have mental health, and all of the other things. Security is fundamental. Now, for none of those 3 things do we need pilots. right? Because they're fundamental about our values. And therefore, we have to be very careful what we want from pilots and what they can do and what they cannot do. Now, at the moment, we have what I began calling at the beginning of this year, the year of the pilots, because suddenly they're sexy, they're sexy. So we have pilot in Finland, we have pilots in Dutch cities, all going to take place. We have Ontario, where I've just been, where Hugh Segal is promoting a pilot. We have Sam Altman, I met earlier this year in a very strange place, and he's pledged $20 million to do a pilot in California, and I'm going there shortly to be advising them. We have Give Directly sprouting up. We have wonderful programs on TV. We have crowdfunding basic income pilots in Germany, Netherlands, USA. I was in New Zealand, and the New Zealand Labour Party, New Zealand Labour Party has come out in favour of pilots. Jeremy Corbyn, with whom we've been working behind the scenes, I hope he survives. I hope he survives. And John McDonnell, his backup man, as it were, they are committed to doing pilots. And we have the Alternative, and the Scottish Nationalists and others. So we've got this coming up. Very interesting. But we are in dangerous waters. Very dangerous, because in the name of basic income, are these really basic income pilot schemes? It's the big question. My fear is that too many of them are using the name of basic income, but are far from it. And then I ask myself, is it good or bad that these are being called basic income pilots? In a sense, it's good because it's extending the debate. It's making more and more people familiar. But it's potentially bad if it leads to a direction of social policy that none of us in this room should be supporting. A move towards social engineering and libertarian paternalism, where you use the policy to steer people to behave in certain ways, incentivize them to do X rather than Y, because the state wants that. I hope none of us in this room want these pilots to go in that direction. The third point is that there's a political danger that the rhetoric of pilots could be a smokescreen to postpone real reform. There is that danger. I think we can defeat that danger, but only if we recognize it. Now let us just remember, for the sake of the conversation we're going to have in the next 2 days, what a basic income means. I hope most of us are familiar, but let me just remind ourselves. First of all, it's a basic income. This means that it must be an amount that makes a substantial difference to security, freedom, and justice. It's not a total security. We don't want a high income like that. We might dream of it, but that's not the immediate objective, right? The second thing is it must be paid in cash. The third, it must involve a regular payment, not a lump sum. Some of these schemes are doing lump sums, and that's not a basic income scheme. The next is that it must be individual and not household or family-based. It's an individual. And then we get into troubling waters that Ollie and my friends in our movement squirm about. It must be universal. It must not be for the unemployed and not the employed. It must not be for those who are in particular statuses. It's universal or it isn't anything. A universal scheme exists because the community effects, the solidarity effects, are important, not just the individual effects. That is very important. And of course, the next aspect, it's unconditional in behavioral terms. In other words, you get the money and you're not being told you've got to do it, spend it in this way or that way, or behave in this way or that way, or have behaved in this way or that way. It's unconditional in behavioral terms, and it's non-withdrawable. Now, all of those aspects are interrelated and are equally important. You cannot give priority to one and then say, forget the others. Now, there is two other points, background points, that we should always bear in mind. One school of thought, which has been very, very dominant in our discourse, but which is not mine, is that a basic income should replace all other social benefits. This is the libertarian way of looking at it, or replace most benefits, or some benefits. That is one way of approaching it. So you're constantly juggling, well, we'll take this away and give it that. The second way of doing it, which I believe is going to be a stronger argument in the future, is to see a basic income as a social dividend, as something separate, that is built up as part of a new income distribution system for the 21st century. It's a different way of looking at it because you can approach it in a way of building it up. Now, I want to conclude by mentioning some principles, and if anyone's interested, I've written a boring article about these principles of a basic income. The first one, which is effectively what I've said, is that the pilots must respect the definition. I believe that neither the Finland experiment as envisaged at the moment, and Ollie will explain all that shortly, nor the Dutch ones, nor the Give Directly ones, respect the definition. They're not universal, they're selective, and they involve a distortion of the labour market. It's very easy to document these things. The second point is that the pilot design must be clear and sustainable and transparent. Sounds very simple, but if the pilot is an exercise in labour market policy, then it will not advance freedom, it will not advance social justice, or the things that we've just been hearing about, things like identity and respect for work that is not labour, that matter to us, nor the ecological dimensions that are so important to our debate. The next is that the design of a pilot must be kept constant during the course of a pilot. Then the pilot must be adequately large. It's no use having a pilot that has 22 people and a dog. There has to be a sufficient number that you can actually examine the effects. And too many of the exercises are not respecting that fundamental point. It's a boring point, but it's important. The next point is that the duration of the pilot must be sufficient to enable the dynamics to take effect. There are learning effects that impact. If I start a pilot tomorrow, you'll be able to see some effects within a couple of weeks. But the real effects take time. It's not like boiling a bloody egg. You know, it's a matter of taking time, seeing the impact, seeing if effects wear off, seeing the multiplier effects taking place. And remember this, having been involved in pilots which have taken 6 years of my life, I warn you that those doing it must have stamina. The fatigue factor is very important. I don't want to tell this very loudly to Ollie just in case he gets demoralized. He's a friend. But that factor has to be taken into account. The next thing is we live in an era of the randomistas. Randomized controlled trials are sexy, and we're told they're revolutionizing social policy. Only through randomized controlled trials can we make any social advance. I have short Anglo-Saxon words for such people. It is useful to have control groups. It's important, it's vital. But you don't actually learn everything through the randomistas. Randomized controlled trials are all very well for testing a malaria tablet. You can give one that you think works, you give a placebo to somebody else, and you give nothing to somebody else, and you monitor the effect on the disease. But with a social policy, you can't do that. First of all, you can't have a placebo without a riot. Second, you cannot choose him to give a basic income and then the next door neighbor not a basic income. He would be stoned the next morning, or he would have to share it. Retributive justice. But you can have a randomized thing like we've done in India, where a whole community gets the basic income and another community over here does not, and you compare. But don't expect miracles even from that. It's good for low-hanging fruit hypotheses. Does a basic income improve the nutrition of children? Yes or no? Does it improve the health? Yes or no? These are low-hanging fruit hypotheses. They're not that low, let me tell you. But if I talk about emancipation and justice and security for a community and the multiplier effects, they ain't so good. So you could use randomized control trial and sophisticated econometrics and show, look, work has not increased, therefore it's a bad scheme. But that's because you're not actually involved in an analysis of the far more important things. Okay? So I think randomized controlled trials are useful, and I've done them. They're boring, but they're not perfect. The next thing is, in doing pilots, you have to have a baseline survey before it starts, interim surveys, long-term surveys, to see the dynamics. And then, and we are the first, I think, ever to do this, you have to have a survey after the end of the pilot to find out what are the legacy effects, what are the lingering, lasting effects. We did one in India 6 months after we ended the pilot, and I'm just delighted to tell you that the richest man in India, Mr. Premji, and his delightful wife, have just given some more funds for us to do a legacy survey in the communities, plus do a further pilot in India. And the Indian government is about to issue its economic report early next year, when there's going to be a whole chapter of the government's major economic report about the possibility of moving to a basic income. That's due to the pilots, so it can have effects. The next point, and I really fundamentally urge you, if anybody is interested in doing pilots, to follow this religiously. I'm not religious, but follow this religiously. And that is the hypotheses that you're testing with your pilot must be made explicit before you start the pilot. What is it we are going to test? Because that is going to affect both your design, both the way you implement it, design the questionnaires, the survey instruments. It took us 6 months to design the questionnaires based on a list of hypotheses. And the hypotheses add up to, is a basic income transformative? Is it going to have a multiple set of effects? The last point I want to make is this. We are the only pilot, our Indian pilot, to do the two things that most of us in this room believe. The two things are this. To be a rational human being with freedom, you need basic income. But basic income by itself is not enough. You also need basic voice, a sense of agency. If you don't have access to an organization or organizations to represent our interests, Even if I give everybody a basic income, we will still remain vulnerable to the bastards, the plutocrats, the powerful bureaucrats, etc. Unless we have voice, collective and individual voice, we will remain vulnerable. So what we've done in the Indian pilots is half the villages had a basic income and no access to a voice, and the other half had basic income and an institutionalized collective voice. And we watched and monitored and analyzed the differences. It will be very interesting in the pilots in industrialized Western countries to take that principle forward, because we do need advice. We do need to be able to turn to figures and organization when we are in distress. That's going to be an interesting aspect of the design. So I thank you for listening. I hope we will continue. I hope that the difficulties of doing pilots will not put people off experimenting, but I also urge all of us to make sure that doing pilots is not an excuse for politicians and others to kick basic income into the long grass, as we call it. We've got to do both at the same time. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Guy Standing, for a very inspiring start of the, of the conference.